Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment of Authors at Google. Today, I'd like to welcome our guests, Thomas Cathcart and Daniel Klein, co-authors of Plato and a Platypus Walk Into a Bar, Understanding Philosophy Through Jokes. These two Harvard philosophy majors, graduates 1961, took different paths after college, but have remained friends, and over the past couple of years, put together this entertaining, pretty accessible book that covers a wide variety of topics, philosophical subjects ranging from ethics to existentialism. About the book, the authors have been quoted to say, "The construction and payoff of jokes and the construction and payoff of philosophical concepts are made out of the same stuff. They tease the mind in the same ways. Philosophy and jokes proceed from the same impulse. To confound our sense of the way things are, to flip our worlds upside down, and to ferret out hidden, often uncomfortable, truths about life. What the philosopher calls an insight, the gagster calls a zinger." What they forgot, other than the fact that no one has used the words gagster or zinger since 1961, is that comedians find ways to present these truths in a way that we can all relate to, while philosophers manage to find ways to present these truths in ways none of us can relate to. You know, insofar as they construct complex theories that are difficult to apply to everyday life. The sure sign of a philosopher is that they're being long-winded and that they use the phrase "insofar as." So I'll just cut that short. No, kidding. I was actually a philosophy major in college. I've always thought philosophy to be a funny thing to study. I mean, philosophy majors have a very whimsical air of hopelessness about them. You know, upon meeting another one, you'd ask, "Oh, you're a philosophy major too?" Kind of like asking, "Oh, you don't want a job either?" But sure enough, people always ask, what are you going to do with a degree in philosophy? Oh, certainly nothing worse than a degree in medieval history. But in honesty, I always thought philosophy was a great subject to major in. And I thought that because philosophy is the only thing you can major in that will teach you how to argue that philosophy was a good thing to major in. Just kind of let that sink in for a sec. Now, it turns out there's at least one thing you can do. You can write books with an old friend about how hilarious philosophy can be. So with that, let's give a round of applause to Thomas Cathcart and Daniel Klein.
So this guy is in bed with his best friend's wife when they hear a car pull up in the driveway, and they recognize immediately that it's the husband. So the guy jumps out of bed, runs and hides in the closet just as the husband has come sauntering in, takes off his coat, goes to the closet to hang it up, opens the door, and there's his best friend standing there, stark naked. He says, "Lou, what are you doing here?" And Lou says, "Everybody's got to be somewhere."
One of the good things about being 40 years older than the audience is our jokes are so old that maybe you haven't heard them before. That story was actually told on the Ed Sullivan Show. Anybody ever hear of the Ed Sullivan Show? Back in the 1950s. So Danny calls me up one night and he tells me this story. And I said, "Oh, I see what's going on there. Lou, the guy in the closet, is giving a Hegelian answer to what was intended as an existentialist question."
Clearly what all of you thought, too. We heard it was a smart group. I don't know.
So Danny says, "Oh, yeah, I see what you mean. You know, Hegel sort of did philosophy from up in the sky somewhere, looking down on the whole sweep of human history, looking down on the universe as if he wasn't a part of it. And the existentialists came along and said, no, you can't do that. You know, you're a human being, you live here. You have to do philosophy from the ground up." So
I always think of Bette Midler as in the German idealist tradition with her song, that I also might be dating myself with this, but do you remember a song called "From a Distance"? And she, no, I won't do it. But
yeah, would you do 8 bars of
no,
it?
No. I think we did 8 bars before we got here. No. But the idea of the song is somebody looking at the earth and all the people from a distance, and how lovely it looks. But as the song progresses and you get a closer look, it looks like shit. and that's sort of where the existentialists, where Kierkegaard stepped in.
So I say this to Danny, and Danny says, "Oh my gosh, there's a book here." I said, "I don't know, Danny. That's going to be a pretty slim book. There are probably 4 jokes in the world that do that." And he said, "No, there are hundreds." So we went away for a weekend. We holed up in a motel in Gloucester, Massachusetts. We had a pile of joke books on one side and a pile of philosophy books on the other. And at the end of the weekend, I said, "You know what? You're right. There are hundreds of them." So one of the early ones that we discovered as we were looking for jokes that had a philosophical smell to them was a joke that actually sort of undermines the whole empirical philosophy of the modern world. You know, empiricism being the philosophy that underlies science, that says that all of our knowledge of the outside world comes to us through sensory experience.
Yeah, and historically what happened is somebody like, or in particular, Descartes represented the philosophy that preceded empiricism, and he thought, as many other thinkers did then, that ideas were innate, that you had all your ideas in your being. You didn't have to look at the world or sense the world to get your ideas. But then along came people like David Hume, John Locke, Bishop Berkeley, who I hear they named a college after here. And
Berkeley, yeah.
Actually, Berkeley is named after Berkeley. So Morty, I don't know why all these jokes are about infidelity, but Morty comes home and sees his best friend in bed with his wife. And before he can say anything, his friend sits up and he says, "Before you say anything, what are you going to believe, me or your eyes?" Empiricism in a nutshell.
So another one, that first day that we came across, we said, "Oh, this is the old argument from analogy." You know, the argument from analogy held that if 2 things are similar, they probably have similar causes. And we hear it even today, you know, the so-called intelligent design people say, well, if you came across a watch, you'd think there was a watchmaker. So if you come across a universe, you think there was an intelligent universe maker. You know, and sometimes that analogy works, not in that case particularly, but sometimes it works better than others.
So there's this 90-year-old guy, and he runs into his doctor in the street, and he says, "You won't believe this, doctor, but my 18-year-old wife is pregnant." And the doctor says, "You have a minute? I want to tell you a story." He says, "There's this guy who wants to go out hunting bear. And walking out of the house, instead of picking up his gun, he picks up his umbrella. He goes to the woods, a bear charges him, and he shoots him dead with the umbrella." And the old guy says to the doctor, "Somebody else must have shot him." That's the argument from analogy.
So the more we talked that weekend in Gloucester, the more we began to realize that every major branch of philosophy actually had a number of stories that illustrated philosophical points. You know, the traditional branches are metaphysics, you know, the big questions: does God exist? What is reality? Do I have free will? Ethics.
How many Google people it takes to change a light bulb?
The big questions. Logic, you know, philosophy of religion, epistemology, theories of knowledge. And the more jokes we read, the more we realized that they sort of shook out into these major categories. So the first stop in the book is metaphysics, the biggies, the big questions. And Aristotle, for example, way back 2,500 years ago when he was writing his Metaphysics, he said there's one fundamental distinction when you're talking about anything real, and that's between what he called essential characteristics and accidental characteristics. Essential characteristics, he said, are the characteristics that make a thing what it is. Without those characteristics, it wouldn't be the same thing. Accidental characteristics are everything else. You know, they're characteristics that a thing may or may not have. It may tell you something about how the thing is, but it doesn't tell you what it is. So he said, for example, he said, take Socrates. He said, Socrates was rational. That was part of his essence, to be rational. So if he wasn't rational, he wouldn't be Socrates. On the other hand, he said Socrates had a snub nose. He said, that's purely an accidental characteristic. He said if he had his nose fixed, he'd still be Socrates. He'd be Socrates with a nose job, but he would still be Socrates.
Well, who would think that there'd be a joke that rides on the distinction between essential and accidental characteristics? So Thompson turns 70, and he decides he wants to really, I'm about to turn 70, but who cares? And he decides he really wants to spruce up. So he goes on this strict diet, and he exercises daily, he plays volleyball, he sits in the sun, he loses 5 inches on his waist, puts 6 inches on his chest, he's well-toned, he's looking terrific. He decides he's gonna top it all off with a sporty young haircut, goes to the barbershop, gets the haircut, steps outside, and a bus runs him over. He's lying in the gutter, dying, and he looks up to the heavens, and he said, God, how could you do this to me? And a big voice from above says, to tell you the truth, Thompson, I didn't recognize you. Why God has a Jewish accent is another.
Now, there's a funny little philosophical twist to that story. You know, we all know that he's still essentially Thompson, that's why we laugh. Thompson knows he's still essentially Thompson, that's why he asks. The only character in the story that doesn't realize he's still essentially Thompson is God, whom you think would be essentially omniscient.
Yeah, so much for omniscient gods, right?
It turns out there's another old story that also illustrates this same distinction, essential versus accidental.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
What one was that? Oh yeah, it's the old riddle. It's an old shtetl riddle from Eastern Europe. And these were absurdist riddles that also often played on logic and epistemological mistakes. Tom, what's green, hangs on a wall, and whistles?
Green hangs on a wall and whistles.
You heard me right.
I have no idea.
A herring.
A herring? A herring isn't green.
You put some paint on it, it's green.
A herring doesn't hang on the wall.
You put a nail through it, it's on the wall.
But a herring doesn't whistle.
Yeah, so it doesn't whistle. One of my father's favorites.
Yeah. You'll hear a lot of old Jewish jokes today because we're old and he's Jewish. But, you know, sometimes properties that seem like they're only accidental, it turns out that's only true within a certain range. You know, like for example, what is big? Why is an elephant, almost screwed up the joke, why is an elephant big, gray, and wrinkled? Anybody? Because if it was small, white, and round, it would be an aspirin. Okay. So,
I like that one too. But it plays with the idea of what's an essential characteristic.
So for example, you know, if you saw somebody taking one of these, you wouldn't be tempted to say, is that an aspirin you're taking, Bob, or an atypical elephant? You know, that question wouldn't even occur to you. So the next stop on the book was the chapter on logic. And logic, as you guys probably know better than most, can be a very sort of cut and dried subject, you know, subject to rigid rules. You wouldn't think it would be great territory for jokes. As it turned out, it was the easiest chapter in the book to write. There are a million logical jokes, including a joke that speaks to the most basic rule that Aristotle identified of logic, which is the law of non-contradiction. You know, the same thing can't be both A and not A at the same time, the law of non-contradiction. And if you didn't obey that rule, then it would be ollie free. You know, you couldn't have any logic at all. That's sort of the basis of all rational discourse. There's even a joke about that.
There is. And again, it's from the shtetl. And the rabbi is holding court, and somebody stands up and he says, Rabbi, Shmuel over here is taking his sheep across my land, and it's ruining my crops. He shouldn't be allowed to do that. And the rabbi says, you're right. And then Shmuel stands up and he says, but Rabbi, if they can't, my sheep can't get across the land, they can't get to the watering hole, they'll die of dehydration. And anyway, there's been a right of way across this land to the watering hole for centuries. So I should be allowed to take my sheep across there. And the rabbi says, you're right. And somebody in the back says, but Rabbi, they both can't be right. And he says, you're right. He knew Aristotle.
Again, this audience knows this better than most. You know, if you don't obey the rules of logic, you can end up in some very strange territory, and some of you probably have. And there's a story about a guy who goes into a Dublin pub. I don't know why I get the Irish jokes, he gets the Jewish jokes.
It's arbitrary.
Arbitrary?
Yeah, it's arbitrary.
So this guy goes into a Dublin pub and he says, bartender, I'll have 3 pints of Guinness if you would. The bartender says, sure, lad, and he draws him the 3 pints of Guinness, serves him. The man sits there and drinks them one after another. When he's done, he says, bartender, I'll have 3 more pints. The bartender says, well, sure, lad, but could I make a suggestion? He said, if I drew them for you one at a time, they'd be much less likely to go flat. And he says, oh, I know. But he says, the reason I drink this way, he says, is I have 2 brothers. He says, one's in Australia, the other's in the States. And he said, when we parted, we promised each other that we would always drink this way in memory of the days when we used to drink together. And the bartender says, that's a lovely custom, my lad. So he pours him the 3 pints. Guy drinks them one after another and leaves. Well, he becomes a regular in the bar. Every night he comes in, he sits down in the same stool. He always orders the same way, 3 pints of Guinness. Bartender brings him the 3 pints. He drinks them one after another. Bartender brings him 3 more. He drinks them and leaves. About a month after he starts coming to the bar, he comes in one night and sits down at his usual stool and he says, bartender, I'll have 2 pints of Guinness. And a hush falls over the bar. And the bartender says, oh, lad, please accept my condolences. And the guy says, oh, no. He says, everybody's fine. He said, I just became a Mormon and I had to give up drinking.
It's called self-serving logic.
A philosopher of science that many of you have probably heard of is a German-American guy from the mid-20th century named Karl Popper. And one of the things that Karl Popper is famous for is his notion of falsifiability. And what he meant by that was, he said, in order for a theory to be worth its salt, there has to be some conceivable set of circumstances that would prove it false, right? Because if everything proves it true, what kind of theory is that, you know? Yeah. So there has to be some conceivable set of circumstances that would prove it false. So there's even a story that illustrates the idea of falsifiability.
Yeah, we have slipped now from deductive to inductive logic, for those of you who are taking notes.
And there'll be a quiz afterwards.
I remember being knocked out, as a kid reading Karl Popper, because I had just been reading Freud for the first time. I'd come out of a public high school. I never heard any of this stuff. And I was so sold by things like the Oedipus complex, What a great theory. It explains all human behavior. And then when I read Karl Popper, I realized that there were no conceivable circumstances that would prove this theory untrue. You hate your mother, that's because you have an inverted Oedipus complex. You love your mother, you got it head on. You're indifferent to your mother, there are no conceivable circumstances that will disprove the Freudian theory. I get in trouble with some groups saying that, but it's true. So these 2 guys are having breakfast. And one guy says to the other, you ever notice that whenever you drop a piece of buttered bread, it always lands butter side down? And the other guy says, no, it just appears that way because those are the only ones you remember. It's messy, you have to clean it up, so those stick in your mind. And the guy says, no, I'm sure that it happens more frequently. And he says, let's just do it now. He makes a piece of toast, he puts bread on it, he flips it, and it lands butter side up. And his friend says, see? And the first guy says, oh, I see what happened. I buttered the wrong side. No conceivable evidence will disprove his theory.
So while we were looking at logic, we began to take a look at the logical fallacies, the classical logical fallacies, most of which Aristotle actually described 2,500 years ago. It hasn't stopped us from falling into them, but and one of the most common ones is the circular argument. And some of you engineers may have fallen into this one from time to time. Circular argument, of course, being where the evidence for a proposition is the proposition itself. So, Danny, I think you might have a circular argument story, do you?
I do, thank you. So there's this chief of a Native American tribe, and unfortunately he was sent to one of these elite colleges in the East and didn't get any education about the native ways. And when he came back to lead his tribe, they asked him, is it going to be a cold winter? Well, he had none of the old lore, he didn't know. So he said, yeah, I think it's going to be a pretty cold winter. And then he felt very insecure, but the tribespeople started to gather wood, and then he felt even more insecure. So he called up the National Weather Service, and he said, what kind of a winter is it going to be? And they said, oh, it's going to be a pretty cold winter. Oh, he felt more confident. He went back to his people. It's going to be, yeah, definitely a cold winter. They gathered some more wood, and then he started to feel a little uneasy. He called up the Weather Service again, and he says, what kind of a winter is it going to be? And the Weather Service guy says, I think it's going to be one of the worst winters we had in history. And the chief says, what makes you think that? And he says, well, hell, the Indians are gathering wood like crazy.
Fortunately, they were using a circular saw, so it worked out. One very common fallacy that turns out to be a gold mine for jokes is the post hoc, ergo, propter hoc fallacy. Latin scholars, after this, therefore, because of this, sounds better in Latin. You know, because A came before B, A must have been the cause of B, not. But you hear this all the time, and you particularly hear politicians use it a lot. Not sure they use it out of ignorance or if they use it because they're trying to pull a fast one, but in any case,
I don't know the difference, actually.
How many times have you heard a political figure say, well, marijuana may not be a dangerous drug in itself, but it's a gateway drug, right? Because 85% of heroin addicts started off using marijuana, which is apparently true. But 100% started with milk. Post.
It gives you pause, you know? It turns out there are a wealth of post hoc, ergo, propter hoc jokes, most of them, to my delight, filthy. Here's one of my favorites. This guy has a terrible, terrible headache. He goes from doctor to doctor. Nobody can find the cause of it. He finally goes to one doctor. He gives him the very state-of-the-art complete body scan. And he calls the guy into his office. He says, well, I finally identified the cause of your headaches, and it's very rare and very sad. He says, but what's happening is your testicles are pressing against the base of your spine, and that's why you have headaches all the time. And unfortunately, the only cure is to have a surgical castration. Ooh. This is a sad story. It gets worse. The guy goes, you know, castration, headaches, castration. And he finally decides to have the operation. He has the operation. He's in a pretty bad mood afterwards. And in the past, the only thing that has ever cheered him up is to go to the clothing store and get a new set of duds. That somehow picks up his spirits. So he's passing in the clothing store. He sees a nice suit in the window. He walks in and he says, sir, I'd like it. He says to the salesman, I'd like that suit. And the guy says, fine. He looks at him and he said, that'd be a 42 long. Guy says, that's quite amazing. How do you do that? The salesman says, I've been in this business all my life. I can size anybody up. That's, well, great. He says, while I'm here, I think I'll get a shirt too. And the guy said, that'd be a 16 and a half neck, 34 sleeve. He says, boy, you are right again. You are bloody amazing. How the heck do you do that? That's great. You know, while I'm here, I think I'll get a pair of briefs too. And the guy says, yep, that'd be a 42 brief. And the guy says, no, for once you're wrong. I wear a 36 brief. And the salesman says, oh, hell, you don't want to wear a 36. He says, that'll press your balls against the base of your spine and give you one hell of a headache. Post hoc.
Post hoc. Ergo.
Can I do another one, Tommy?
Could I stop you?
There's another one from the shtetl. This old guy has married a younger wife, I know whereof, and so he can't in bed satisfy her, and he's really feeling awful about it. So he goes to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, I have this situation, explains it. And the rabbi says, well, there's actually a standard way of dealing with that. What you do is you get somebody to stand next to the bed and wave a towel over the two of you while you're making love. He says, get a younger guy, and that should take care of it. So he hires a younger guy. The guy waves the towel. He gets in bed, goes at it. Wife doesn't feel a thing. He's really depressed. He goes back to the rabbi, and the rabbi says, well, in some of these cases, we have to make a slight adjustment in the procedure. What you do is you put the younger guy in bed with your wife, and you wave the towel. The guy does that. He puts the younger guy in bed with his wife. He waves the towel. His wife is going crazy, yelling, screaming, orgasm after orgasm. At the height of the 10th one, the old guy looks down and says, schmuck, that's the way you wave a towel. It's the old post hoc.
Post hoc, ergo propter. Who knew there were so many post hoc? We'll tell you one more. A Gentile man is going to marry a Jewish woman. And so before the wedding, she comes to him and she says, dear, there's one request I'd like to make. She says, this is kind of a biggie, but it would be very important to me. She said, particularly it would be important to my mother if you were to convert to Judaism. So the guy thinks about it for a moment, and he says, oh, okay, I'm willing to do that. Just tell me what's involved. And she says, well, the first thing is you'll have to become circumcised. The guy says, circumcised? Let me think about that for a minute. He says, at my age, that sounds kind of painful. She says, well, I don't know. So he seeks out a Jewish male friend, and he says, look, I'm about to be circumcised. He says, I'm a little nervous about it. He said, can you tell me, does it hurt? And the Jewish friend says, well, to tell you the truth, I was 8 days old when I had it done, so I can't tell you whether it hurt or not. But I'll tell you this, I couldn't walk for a year afterwards.
It seems like that fallacy was just built for jokes.
The next area that we looked at was epistemology, theories of knowledge. How do we know the things we think we know? Or do we know the things we think we know? And one of the early controversies, actually still alive today, but one of the early controversies was between reason and revelation, reason and divine revelation. How much stock do you put in what your own rationality tells you versus how much stock do you put in revelation from beyond?
This is what? I have to stop doing something? A little further from the mic.
Not as smooth as I would have pulled that off, yes.
Fly me to the moon. No, okay. This is another one of my father's favorites. There was, this will show how much older I am than you are. There used to be an expression in my father's generation that there are no atheists in the foxholes. Have you ever heard that one? It's a First World War expression, that when you're confronted with life and death, you opt for God. Here's the joke. This old, well, he doesn't have to be an old guy, right? It's just a regular guy. Let's say 36.
Yeah, about our age.
Okay. He's going for a walk in the woods. He falls down a well by mistake, and he's falling, and he's flailing around. And finally, he reaches out, and he grabs the spindly root that's coming out of the wall of the well. And he looks up, and all he sees is this circle of light up there. And he looks, and he says, is there anybody up there? Silence. Nothing. Is there anybody up there? All of a sudden, there's a thunder crack. A beam of light falls down the shaft, and a big voice says, I am the Lord your God. Have faith in me, and I will save you. Let go of the root. Is there anybody else up there?
Okay. Well, the theory of knowledge that carried the day in the West, obviously, was empiricism, the philosophy of science. There's a scientist and his wife are out for a ride on a Sunday afternoon, and she says to her husband, look at that flock of sheep. They've all been shorn. And the husband says, well, yes, on this side. But it turns out that the wife is actually the better scientist, right? Because science isn't just about sensory experience, it's also about being able to interpret your experience, being able to bring prior experience to bear, being able to form probabilities. So in effect, what the wife is saying is, that flock of sheep looks to be shorn. In my experience, farmers don't usually shear sheep on only one side. And even if this farmer did, what are the odds that they all lined up on the hill with their shorn sides facing the road, right? Okay, so she's the better scientist. So lots of jokes play on this territory of being able to interpret experience. And there's a whole range, a whole plethora on the web of jokes that are Indian jokes and that are Sardar jokes. And we realize that many of your employees are Indian, and so we're going to apologize for the political incorrectness of this joke in advance. But apparently there are so many of these that they're quite common in India. And Sardars, the religious minority of Sardars or Sikhs, play the same role in Indian jokes as blondes or Poles or Swedes or whomever.
Yeah, they used to be in the Jewish culture the wise men of Helm, who always made mistakes, stupid mistakes, and they had a lot of jokes about them. So this is a great Sardar joke. So the head of detectives in New Delhi is giving a test to these new recruits. They're all Sardars, and so he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a picture of the suspect. And you tell me what you deduce and what you find out about him, just by a quick look. So he shows the first one, a picture, and the guy says, well, this guy's going to be easy to find. He has one eye. And the detective says, hey, you idiot. He says, no, I just showed you his picture in profile. That's why, get out of here. You're not going to pass the test. And so it calls the second one. Pushes it again, and the guy says, oh, that guy's going to be easy to identify. He only has one ear. And he says, you idiot, it's a profile. That's why I think he only has one ear. Calls in the third guy studies it, and he says, I think this guy must wear contact lenses. And the chief of detectives says, that's really amazing. That is quite... Let me check the records. And he goes into his office, he checks the records, and sure enough, the suspect wears contact lenses. He comes back, he says, you are brilliant. How did you figure that out? And the guy says, well, I figure with only one eye and one ear, he couldn't wear glasses. Tommy, can we tell the King of Poland joke? I just think this is a joke that we had to take out of our repertoire because nobody I don't want to put the pressure on you, but, but this is one of both of our favorites. There's the King of Poland and a retinue of dukes and everybody. They're going out hunting for elk. They go out to the woods and have all their guns ready, and all of a sudden a serf comes running out of the woods shouting, I am not an elk, I am not an elk. And the King of Poland shoots him dead. And one of the dukes says, but good sire, why did you do that? He said, I am not an elk. And the king says, oh, I thought he said I am an elk. Maybe it's just not funny, Tom.
Yeah. we learn something every time.
I think we'll keep that one out forever. Okay.
One thing about empiricism, it has become so much the primary theory of knowledge in the West that it's now our default position, right? If somebody tells you that they know something about the world, you assume that they got that information either through their own senses or somebody else's senses who passed it on to them. But in any case, we assume that knowledge came from sensory experience. So there's even a story that illustrates how empiricism has become our default position. There are 3 women standing in the locker room of their club when all of a sudden a man goes running through the locker room. He's wearing nothing but a bag over his head. And the first woman looks at him and says, well, at least it's not my husband. The second woman looks at him and says, no, it isn't. And the third woman looks at him and says, he's not even a member of our club.
The triumph of empiricism.
Right after the British empiricists sort of taught us all how to think empirically, the next probably major European philosopher was Immanuel Kant. And we thought, gee, this guy is so abstruse, we're never going to find a story that illustrates anything that Kant had to say about anything. Wrong. One of the distinctions that Kant made was between analytic and synthetic statements. He said there are two kinds of statements, analytic and synthetic. Analytic statements are statements that are true by definition. All horses are animals. You don't need to go look at the world to see that that's true. You can do that prior to experience, a priori. Yeah, you just look it up in the dictionary. Horse, kind of animal. In fact, if you came across something that you thought was a horse and it turned out to not to be an animal, well, it wasn't a horse either, right? All horses are animals, true by definition. The other kind of statement he said is synthetic, and that's everything else. Some horses are lame. You're not going to find that out by looking up horse in the dictionary. You got to go out and look at actual horses. And if you find some that are lame, you can say some horses are lame. So that's basically the distinction.
Yeah, I just wanted to inject that that's the same lineage as Aristotle's distinction between essential and accidental characteristic. It's different, I know, but it's the same lineage.
Similar, yeah. Aristotle was talking about things and Kant was talking about words, but yeah, it's the same kind of distinction. Okay, and it turns out there are hundreds of jokes that turn on analytic versus synthetic statements.
I think I'll tell one.
Please.
This is another of my father's favorites. My dad used to say, there's a surefire way to live to a ripe old age. What you do is you eat a meatball a day for 100 years.
By definition,
if you eat anything for 100 years, you'll live to a ripe old age.
Yeah, sort of by definition, 100 years is an old age, so yeah. Okay, so here's a more complicated one.
Oh yeah. This is our big number. Thanks.
Okay. Mics may be a problem here. Oh, no, actually, we need this one. Thank you. This is a prop. We'll all stay near this mic so that we can be heard around the world. A guy goes in to pick up a custom-made suit that he's had.
That's called a bespoke suit.
A bespoke suit, yes. Custom-made suit. Here, try this on. Oh. That suit is you. Perfect. The coat fits you perfectly.
You call this custom made? Look at the sleeves on this thing. I can't even get my hands out.
Not a problem. Here, just hold your arms up like that. There, good. Oh, perfect.
Yeah. Now look what it does to the collar. The collar rides all the way up my neck.
We can fix that easily. Just lean your head back like that. Okay.
Yeah, but now it's hanging down,
Oh, in the back? Oh, yeah. Well, there's an easy cure for that. Just lean forward like that. Okay. Thank you so much, and come again. As he's walking out of the store, two passersby see him walking by, and one of them says, "Oh, my God, look at that poor man. My heart really goes out to him." And the other guy says, "Yeah, but his tailor's a genius. He fit him perfectly with that suit."
How does that explain analytic and synthetic?
Thank you for asking. Yes, from the these people know, from the passersby point of view, the passerby thinks he's saying something new about the world, right? He's saying something about the skill of the tailor. But from the tailor's point of view, he knows it's an analytic statement. It's true by definition. Any coat he makes for this guy is going to fit him because he fits the guy to the coat.
That's it. And we'd like to answer any questions that you'd have for us.
Thank you.
Anybody?
Any questions or comments or jokes? We collect jokes.
I don't like jokes.
Anybody? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Sorry.
Any plans for a second book?
Yes, actually, there's a second book out right now called Aristotle and an Aardvark Go to Washington, Understanding Political Doublespeak Through Philosophy and Jokes. It's about logical fallacies, the fallacies that our politicians commit either on purpose or accidentally.
It's about bullshit, actually.
It's about bullshit. Yeah. References, yes. Yes, with actual quotations.
Yes.
And we have another book coming out next year called Heidegger and a Hippo Walk Through Those Pearly Gates, Understanding Life, Death, and the Hereafter through through the eyes of philosophers, theologians, and comedians.
It's basically about death.
Death.
A subject we figured we should get acquainted with at our age. Actually, we had dinner with our publisher, Penguin, in New York at the beginning of the tour. And I floated the idea that for a publicity stunt, while we were on tour, one of us would die. And he didn't think, he didn't think it was funny. But Tom didn't either, because I thought he would be the one who died.
In your book, you cite Groucho Marx as a philosophical grandfather.
You betcha.
Can you expound upon that a bit?
We're Marxists.
Yeah. No, he was very gifted at the absurd. Our dedication quote is when Groucho said, "These are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others." And also one of my favorites of his, he says, outside of a dog, this has no philosophical import except wordplay, he says, outside of a dog, a book is man's best friend. Inside a dog, it's too dark to read. But the lineage there, I think, is Groucho goes to Woody Allen, who has lots of philosophical humor, and Steve Martin, who has loads of philosophy. In fact, studied out here at Berkeley, did his graduate studies in philosophy. So I think that's the lineage. And then we just came across, maybe you know him better than we do, but we've just discovered a young comedian who has lots of philosophical content called Emo Phillips. Is that familiar to any of you? We just heard about him and listened to some of his stuff. Some of his jokes about religion are fabulous, very trenchant and funny.
Thanks.
So 2 questions. One is, have you heard of Eddie Izzard? And what do you think of him?
Heard of whom?
Eddie Izzard.
Eddie Izzard. Yes, I actually read an article in the New Yorker about Eddie Izzard.
Yeah.
Outrageous.
Yeah, I've seen him perform. Yeah, he's a cross-dressing guy. Yeah. I saw him, and then actually a friend of mine was involved in a short-lived series that he did called The Riches, I think that was. Yeah, he's funny. I don't know whether he has any philosophical content the way we think of it, but he's a funny guy. There are a lot of funny guys out there again, which makes me happy.
So my real question is, different cultures have very different joke content.
Yes.
Indian culture has extremely different jokes compared to American culture. Do you find something similar in philosophy as well, because you're looking at jokes and philosophy?
Oh, that's a very good question. I'm not sure of the answer. We've had some fun with translators, though. Plato and the Platypus has been translated into 20 languages, including Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and all of the European languages, I guess. And we actually had an extensive correspondence with the Korean translator.
Oh, let me tell that joke. Can I tell
Please
that
do.
joke? So this was the joke, that the Korean translator, fortunately Tom handled this one, the Korean translator was baffled about how to translate it. And the joke goes like this. A Jewish guy is having lunch in the park. He's brought his lunch with him during Passover. And he notices there's a blind guy next to him. So he says, "You want something to eat?" to the blind guy. And the blind guy says, "Sure." And he hands him a piece of matzah. And the blind guy handles it and he says, "Who writes this shit?" So
it took like 7 volleys of email.
They hadn't heard of
unpeel all
matzah
the
for a
layers.
start,
Yeah.
and I don't think they had Braille. But other than that, it was crystal clear, Finally, I think you told them to drop it, right?
Yeah. When in doubt, drop it.
We can't predict where it becomes a big seller. Like, it's a bestseller in France, and it's been a bestseller in France for a long time. It was, I don't know whether it still is, a bestseller in Israel. But in my wife's country, Holland, it bombed, possibly because they don't have a sense of humor.
She's laughing. Can we tell you one death joke?
We got a million of them. Right?
Martin Heidegger, one of the 20th century existentialists, had a big thing about the anxiety of death and how the only way to live authentically and fully was to take that anxiety into oneself and not deny death. If you deny death, you just sink into what he called everydayness. which means, you're kind of half alive. You're just sleepwalking. So he said, you want to be intensely aware of the fact that your life is finite and someday you're going to die. So there are a whole bunch of jokes about denial of death. And one of them is that 3 guys are killed in a car crash, 3 friends, and they meet up together at the pearly gates. And they're waiting for St. Peter to let them in. They get to talking, and one of them says, wouldn't you like to be able to look down on the people who are at your wake and overhear what they're saying about you? And the second guy says, well, that's an interesting thought. He says, what would you like them to be saying? The first guy says, gee, I don't know, I guess I would want them to say that I was a wonderful family man, I always provided well for my family, and I did a lot of good things for my kids. The second guy says, yeah, I wish I would hear somebody say that I was a terrific physician, that I had a great bedside manner, that I always took great care of the families who came to me. The third guy said, I don't know, I'd just like to hear somebody say, look, he's moving.
Thank you all very much.